For the Washington Examiner, I'm Siraj Hashmi, and this is Hashing It Out. I'm joined by Congressman Devin Nunes of California, Republican, ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, former chairman from 2015 to 2019. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be with you. Welcome. Thanks for coming into my office.
No, it's great to be with you. So really want to get into some of the background first before we get into some of the newsier stuff. So starting off first, for those who have not been following, what exactly is Crossfire Hurricane?
Well, it was started, it was an FBI counterintelligence investigation into the Trump campaign. And it started, officially started end of July 2016, while then President Trump was a candidate. Now the reality is that investigation, you've probably heard me say this numerous times, but that's not true. It's a lie. It actually started much before that. And we don't know if it was 6 months or some people think it could have been 2015, but for sure it was started early 2016. So it doesn't mean it had an official name of Crossfire Hurricane, but the bottom line is that they were spying on the Trump campaign and targeting the Trump campaign in early 2016. And then they opened an umbrella investigation that they called Crossfire Hurricane in the middle of 2016.
You've called out the intelligence community for politicizing intelligence in light of this whole Crossfire Hurricane multiple times. How should we be addressing this?
So there's two. I put it actually into, well, there's two main buckets of the criminality here that I believe that Durham needs to be looking at. But there's also another bucket, and let me talk about that first. There's a bunch of leaks that have happened. Massive leaks of very sensitive information that should have never been let out. The obvious one that everybody knows about is who leaked the phone call with General Flynn talking to as incoming national security advisor, talking to the Russian ambassador. I mean, that massive leak, there should have been every FBI agent in Washington, D.C. should have been descending on that to figure out how did that leak out. That was such a high level leak. Then later came a leak of the president talking to his counterpart in Mexico and then in Australia. Okay, so let's set that aside.
Sure.
Leaks of classified information, likely gathered from intelligence agencies, leaked out everywhere. There's been no investigation. Nobody's been brought to justice for high level leaks. Second, so let's go to those two buckets. One is the manipulation of intelligence for political purposes. And that's what we've said that needs to be looked into, that people conspired to defraud the government. And that involves the whole intelligence community assessment that was put together right after the election in 2016, right before Trump was sworn in. So that came out, what I call that Obama's dossier, because, and 98% of it was fine. I mean, we agreed with 98% of it, but there are pieces in it that are still classified that clearly was manipulation of intelligence for political purposes. That's one bucket. And then the second bucket, as you getting back to Crossfire Hurricane, is there was fraud on the court and people's civil rights were violated. I mean, Carter Page is the obvious one, but I think many others were violated too. And that's a much more complex, broad, did it start late 2015, early 16, and it went basically all the way until Mueller collapsed in his testimony before the House and Senate.
During the 2016 presidential election, the FBI opened a counterintelligence investigation codenamed Crossfire Hurricane into Donald Trump's campaign over whether they were coordinating with the Russian government. The FBI claims the investigation began on July 31st, 2016, shortly after they got a tip from the Australians about Trump campaign advisor George Papadopoulos. WikiLeaks had released DNC emails just 9 days before. This timeline has been strongly contested by Nunes based on his investigation of the investigators, which he dubbed Objective Medusa. Nunes believes the investigation started in early 2016 or late 2015, at least 6 months before the FBI's official timeline starts. While the FBI points to Papadopoulos as the impetus of the investigation, Carter Page, another foreign policy advisor on the Trump campaign, was also under intense focus by the FBI. On October 21, 2016, the FBI obtained a warrant under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA for short, to use physical and electronic surveillance on Page following publication of a September 23 Yahoo News report by Michael Isikoff stating that there was evidence of, quote, significant and disturbing ties, end quote, between the Trump campaign through Carter Page and the Kremlin. It was later revealed that the September 23rd news article and other information used to support the FISA warrant application came from the now infamous Steele dossier, which has been debunked and discredited as salacious and unverified, even by the president's greatest rivals. The dossier was compiled by the former British spy Christopher Steele and propped up through the practice of circular reporting, as well as high-level leaks of classified information that seemed to confirm claims in the dossier. How would you describe the relationship between the media, foreign intelligence services, and the IC, the intelligence community, as well as some of these private contractors that sort of market themselves as intelligence firms like Fusion GPS?
Yeah. Well, there's a few different ways to look at that. For the most part, I want everybody to know that most of the folks that are doing intelligence work for the 17 different agencies that we have in the United States are patriots. They do very difficult work in difficult situations and do a great job to keep America safe. You know, especially we know just from the counterterrorism challenges that we've had over the last 20 years, roughly, they've done a pretty good job. I mean, real good job in many cases. What happened during the Obama administration is the highest levels of our intelligence agencies became politicized, likely starting, not necessarily starting, but there were a lot of cover-ups that happened, whether it was Benghazi attack or the rise of ISIS or the Iran nuclear agreement. All of those things were cover-ups. You could also add to that list the Obama administration's lack of interest in Russia and their inability to understand Putin's plans and intentions, which I called the biggest intelligence failure since 2001, September 11th, 2001. I said that as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Ironically, in the spring of 2016, right at the time they began spying on the Trump campaign, concocting this Russia hoax that supposedly the Trump campaign were colluding with Russians. The reality is that the Obama administration were colluding with the Russians, and they refused to do simple things like provide the Ukrainians with adequate weapons to defend themselves against invading Russians. So now all these pieces on that international chessboard are tough, but the bottom line is that the Obama administration was busy politicizing intelligence for their own political purposes, which is never good. So it was kind of a slow, rotten decay at the top levels from what I, just looking back now.
And how do you think the media sort of fed into that?
Well, the media is really part of the apparatus of the Democratic Party, of the left. So it's hard to, no offense to you, but there's rough numbers, and there's some science behind this because you know the media people who do give money over time, roughly 90% are left-wing, which is, it's fine, it's their right to be left-wing. Then you've got maybe 5% that are, I would consider, center-right. And you have 5% just trying to do, I think, a legitimate job, but it's harder and harder to find those folks because you have to then look at the companies that they work for. So if nowadays the legacy media is gone in this country. People are trying new ways to reach people. I mean, like your podcast, I mean, that's a growing segment. But the days of newspapers and legacy media networks, they're all on a slow trajectory downward, and there's multiple platforms now that are popping up to provide content. But when you start with 90% of the content being left-wing, then you run it through a lens of Google, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, which is where most of us are receiving our information from, most Americans. You can imagine you stick in 90% of left-wing content, and then you decide what the American should or should not see after it comes out of that funnel. There's a hell of a lot of poisoning going on. And I've seen that firsthand just by watching this whole Russia hoax, Ukraine hoax, impeachment hoax. You can see how many millions of Americans have been poisoned by the content of legacy media and billionaire media being funneled through, coming out, and just people don't know what the hell's going on anymore. The media refuses to even call themselves out on it.
You mentioned the Iran nuclear deal and how that sort of, there have been obviously a lot of people thinking that General Michael Flynn, sort of the target was put on his back because of his thoughts and policy differences with the Obama administration on the Iran nuclear deal. First of all, what happened to Michael Flynn? Like, how did this all transpire? His takedown, him being prosecuted, ultimately indicted and sort of found guilty on.
Well, we don't know. We don't know how this all ends yet. He's obviously withdrawn his guilty plea, which I knew from the beginning that because the FBI had told us that they didn't think he was lying. And I've known General Flynn since the mid-2000s when I first got to know him when he was in Iraq. He's one of our nation's top intelligence generals in the last couple generations. I mean, really a man who masterminded the intelligence behind the surge that really led to the elimination of al-Qaeda in Iraq and other places. So, he's a patriot, an American hero, and I worked with him on the Trump transition team. Him and I were on there, and we were mainly looking at the national security areas because I was chairman of the Intelligence Committee. So we were meeting with ambassadors from different countries, just trying to put together, interview people for all the different positions. I mean, so it was a crazy time. And I can tell you one thing that General Flynn is not, and that is a Russian agent. I mean, it was asinine from the beginning.
To what extent, though, do you think? To what extent do you think? Sorry to cut you off. To what extent do you think it has to do with his policy differences on Iran?
Well, that was why it was Iran and his concern about the growth of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the regrowth of al-Qaeda in Iraq that became ISIS. Mm-hmm. There was those two issues, I believe, why he was fired.
And then following.
So he was fired, and then that's when he started. And then he began. You have to remember, he then began helping. I remember he came and briefed us after he had been fired. He came in to brief us in 2015. He wasn't with Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. He was willing to help out any candidates, including Democrats, because he was a Democrat.
Right.
All this is lost on people. What's happened to him is just a real shame. And then as the Trump campaign started rolling, President Trump trusted him. They brought General Flynn in to brief President Trump, who had been, a business guy, very good at building things and hotels and golf courses. And I would also say he was also good. He was a Hollywood guy. Had the Apprentice show. Those were his strengths.
Right.
So he needed somebody like General Flynn who had been around, who could explain, hey, here's what's happened. So it made sense as one of the few, kind of swamp creatures to support Trump as a candidate. It made sense that he would become the national security advisor. And then I believe he was targeted because he knew where all the bodies were buried, and he knew that the Obama administration had seated here in Washington at the highest levels of the intelligence agencies a bunch of people that he knew were not up to par.
With respect,
and he would have brought in a whole new crop of people, and of course he was cut off at his knees before he even got started.
In December 2019, Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz released his highly anticipated report on the FISA court. concluding that DOJ and the FBI abused the process of obtaining warrants to surveil the Trump campaign. According to the report, the DOJ and FBI made 17 significant errors and omissions in obtaining 4 FISA warrants against Trump campaign advisor Carter Page in 2016 and 2017. The DOJ and FBI also made extensive use of the Steele dossier. On top of all that, the FISA court was unaware that the Steele dossier was compiled at the behest of the private intelligence firm Fusion GPS, which had been hired by Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic National Committee. It was also not revealed to the FISA court that Christopher Steele had a strong desire to see Trump defeated in the 2016 election. In February 2018, almost 2 years prior to the release of the IG report, Nunes, who was then the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, published a 4-page memo stating that the FBI, quote, may have relied on politically motivated or questionable sources, end quote, to obtain the FISA warrants on Carter Page. Following the release of the IG report in December 2019, Rosemary Collyer, the presiding judge of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or FISC for short, publicly ordered the FBI to fix their process over how investigators seek to obtain FISA warrants. In January 2020, FBI Director Christopher Wray announced a series of proposed reforms, including overhauling its training program for agents and lawyers to avoid future abuse of the FISA process. While Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz had a narrow focus in his investigation, Attorney General William Barr appointed U.S. Attorney John Durham to oversee a review of the origins of the Russia investigation and decide whether the intelligence collected on the Trump campaign was legal and appropriate. With respect to the IC, the intelligence community, there have obviously been you talk about how 95% of them are patriots. I don't get the sense from you that you just think there's a cultural problem, say within the FBI or within the CIA or the NSA. But at the same time, you have these individuals working in the intelligence community who are, say, abusing the FISA process, trying to get warrants to spy on a political campaign, the Trump campaign. How should counterintelligence operations or how should the counterintelligence investigations be opened, and should there be consideration for reforming the FISA process?
Well, it's going to have to be completely overhauled, in my opinion, the FISA process.
What does that look like to you?
We're actually in the process of drafting legislation right now,
Mm-hmm.
with some fixes, and one of the key concerns that we have: do we need to bring the legislative branch in more in terms of our oversight and check over the court? Because we know one thing: the court's not going to police itself. Okay, that's for sure. The FBI has been reluctant to admit anything actually went wrong.
Even though the FISA court acknowledges that there were
today, but that's not entirely truthful, because they were notified a couple of years ago that this problem existed. They had all the intelligence. You didn't need Horowitz for them to know that there was a problem.
Okay.
So the court remains the one that could take some very swift action against, especially the lawyers that filed these FISA applications before the court. So we're trying to figure out how you move forward, working with outside stakeholders, ensuring that, because we do need the capability, okay. But one thing's going to be sure, that we ended up with a FISA court because intelligence agencies were being used in politics. That's how we got. That's
Mm-hmm.
why in the 70s we ended up with the FISA court. So there's going to have to be just something written hard into the law that you cannot target political adversaries. And it never should have happened. They did it they did it kind of in a backwards way. And you've heard the dirty cops, I like to say this over and over again ad nauseum. They say things like, well, we were trying to protect the Trump campaign. We were trying to, which was all nonsense. But that's how they've tried to get around explaining it.
Should the intelligence community be able to rely on the information provided by some of these private intelligence firms, say, for example, Fusion GPS, to, say, get a FISA warrant?
Well, I'll limit what I'm going to say about Fusion GPS because they clearly targeted me. They've admitted it in their book. I'm taking them to federal court under the RICO statutes. So I think they're a very dangerous organization. I wouldn't really call them a intelligence firm as much as they're really a nasty media firm where they plant stories and then they bring up dirt on, they basically dig up dirt and plant dirt, fake dirt, on their opponents. They have a long storied history with that, and they were hired by the Clinton campaign to do just that, which is different than, say, like Christopher Steele in his organization. And there's lots of those little organizations that are all over the globe, which are made up of former spies who build off of their experience, their ability to write up reports. Now, a lot of times, those outside firms are very smart. They have good connections. They can do good assessments. The thing about the Steele dossier, however, is that anyone who's ever read any intelligence reports knew you only had to skim through that thing in January when most of us first saw it to know that, okay, this is not an intelligence report, because Steele didn't write it.
With respect to...
Steele didn't draft that. The Steele dossier he's not the author of the supposed Steele dossier.
So he's more the, sort of like the overseer.
He was he just put his stamp of approval on it, I believe, and then he was paid to go out and market it and sell it to, by Fusion GPS and the Clinton campaign.
Operation Medusa. This is something that you and your team sort of worked on pretty intensely to sort of expose the Russian investigation that was being led by the intelligence community, being led by the special counsel and the FBI. What is the update on there? You had 8 criminal referrals that you had announced in the spring of 2019.
Yeah.
What has
I kind of walked you through 3 of those.
Sure.
Those were those buckets.
Right.
So I kind of walked you through the 3 main buckets, which were the whole FISA crossfire hurricane shenanigans, the manipulation of intelligence, and then the leaks.
Right.
And then you've got the others are basically smaller, like lying to Congress, that sort of thing. And I've never publicly talked about the names of all the people behind that because I just don't think it's appropriate, right? I mean, we've sent over referrals. Everybody that pays any attention to the Russia hoax or Ukraine hoax, they know who the players are, they can imagine. But I'll leave that up to Durham we know there's an investigation.
Sure.
We know that they've been briefed, on all of the information that we dug up. And I hope that Durham can bring some justice to the process.
In the last 11 months, do you expect, after what we've seen in the last year, do you think there will be more coming?
Referrals?
Yeah.
Well, there could be a referral. This is different. It's kind of the same. What I call now, it went from a campaign dirty trick to an attempted coup on the presidency of the United States, and now we're in a status of a permanent coup, where we're going to have these Ukraine hoaxes, and every day is going to be something new. What has happened in that is that we believe the ICIG is refusing to provide evidence to back up his claim that the so-called whistleblower followed all the rules as it relates to the Ukraine hoax. Most notably on whether or not it required firsthand information, which clearly it should. That was what was on the form. They claimed that was not what was on the form, and that form was changed after the fact, and we have yet to have to be provided evidence of who changed it and when, where were the drafts of these forms. So we're asking for documentation for what the ICIG has said. Not to mention that the whistleblower lied on the form and said that he had not spoke to Congress. We now know that he had spoke to the Democrats, the House Intelligence Committee. We don't know who they talked to because that's all murky. But likely this is someone who was tied closely and have known Schiff and or his staff for many years. So another, operative, so to speak. So to answer your question on criminal referrals, if we don't get that documentation, we will have another referral based on that.
Also part of Operation Medusa, one of the things that you filed several defamation lawsuits against Twitter, Liz Mayer, and then two particular Twitter accounts, Devin Nunes' mom and Devin Nunes' cow, one of which was suspended. What was your reasoning behind doing that? Like, what message were you trying to send when you did that?
what we're defamation and slander and libel is not legal in this country. And I have no way to get these stories that were planted by these either by these operatives and then spread by these accounts, spread by other news organizations, spread by Fusion GPS. I can't get those off the internet because they refuse to retract those stories. So that's what this is about, is that I have been defamed and slandered in really nasty ways that have to be removed, or else if you, like you said, I think when you started out this conversation, you said, well, if nobody's really heard of this, explain it from the beginning. Well, the same thing is true if no one has ever heard of me and they go and look up my name. You're going to find story after story after story of not just fake news, but slander and libel.
Have you thought about expanding that?
Which is illegal in this country. And so what I'm trying to do is get those stories taken down, right? And as it relates to Twitter, we're suing them. They're negligent. They knew this was happening on their platform, and they enforced the rules selectively. So, it's all fun and games to have, there's hundreds and hundreds of accounts out there that slander me now on a daily basis that Twitter knows about. When accounts pop up that I don't even consider to be slander, in many cases were just parody. The best example of that would be one that kind of got some growth early on, which was called AOC Press. I can't remember.
As a parody account,
and that was just that was actually just a funny account. There was no slander, there was no defamation that was occurring on that. I'm fine with that. That's not what these are. That's not what these accounts are. They're there to continue the slander on me, and so that's one of the lawsuits involving Twitter and a few others. Then McClatchy, which is one of the largest newspaper companies in the country, they slander and libel me virtually every day, and they refuse to retract their stories. Obviously, we've spoke about Fusion GPS, which I believe is a racketeering outfit. They've destroyed a lot of innocent U.S. citizens and others. So we're looking at them. And then you have the mother of all the fake news, which is CNN, which, after the Republicans in the House, even with no witnesses, our ability to call no witnesses, we destroyed their witnesses by all practical measurement. The House Republicans on the Intelligence Committee destroyed the Democrats' witnesses. Right when that got finished, they slandered me immediately when we finished that round of hearings before we left for Thanksgiving. That was a planned and calculated attack on me to go after my credibility and therefore the Republican Party's credibility, all part of the narrative building that these assassins prostitute themselves in the media to do.
So you consider
so it's not. So I don't find it. It's not funny. It's wrong that you would say that anybody would say that I was taking a trip to Vienna to meet with people that I shouldn't have been meeting with. Okay, it's just wrong, and they used a sole source attorney, if you believe them. We won't know until we get through discovery, because I don't believe that's true, of someone who was working with the Democrats. They knew was not trustworthy. They wanted this guy to go out and slander me. And that's a guy that was trying to get immunity from the Congress.
Are you considering
spinning up conspiracy theories with with the Department of Justice. So I have this suit against CNN that I filed. I told them it was false, and I filed it, right after we had returned. And I said, look, if you're not going to bring it down, then I got to go to federal court. So now we're in federal court, trying to get that story removed from the internet.
Would you say it's somewhat of an uphill battle?
No, I don't think it's uphill at all, other than it just takes a lot of time. I think that's a misnomer. The law is very clear. So, common, kind of just common knowledge out there, and it's like that old trick: if you tell a lie enough times, it just becomes true, which is kind of almost a Marxist and socialist concept.
Right.
And I think the mainstream media have convinced themselves, because they want to convince themselves and they want to believe this, that they just have a right to go out and say whatever the hell they want about public figures. But the truth is, it's not legal. So especially if you do it with malice. So we have a little bit of a higher bar, but I don't think one can argue that in all of these cases that the malice isn't clearly there, especially by just looking at what people say when they're, I joke about this, but it's somewhat true. They're out drunk tweeting at night, and you can see the malice against me and against my colleagues. So I don't think it's going to be a problem I think the courts, and so far the courts have been ruling in my favor, and ironically, none of these slanderous organizations want to meet us in court because they're refusing to, they've slowed down the process to just a crawl. So it's going to take time, but in the end, I have to have faith in that the courts will step in and they'll enforce the law, and ultimately all of these fake news stories will come down, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Moving on to some of the newer stuff, impeachment. The idea that you've exposed all this, this abuse within the intelligence community. Lisa Page, Peter Strzok, FISA, the Steele dossier, and when you come to impeachment, you have the whistleblower complaint, impeachment inquiry. Is it all part of the same plot?
Yes.
How so? Like where's the direct line right there?
So the Matt Gaetz, who's a very funny guy, congressman from Florida, calls the Ukrainian hoax just the cheap knockoff version of the Russia hoax. And so what happened with the Russia hoax, it was very dangerous because, as you know, you had high-level officials involved in it with real power. What happened with the Ukraine hoax, many of the same players, right after Mueller completely imploded, they concocted this idea that that Giuliani and Trump were doing something nefarious in Ukraine, which was all just total nonsense, because the truth is that there's a lot of problems with Ukraine, and the media can say that, when they build a narrative and then just continue to lie about it. So what was their narrative that came out of this? The Republicans and Trump are denying that Russia had done anything, tried to manipulate the election, and they're blaming it on Ukraine now. Nobody ever said that. I mean, the report that has been out the longest was the report that the House Republicans did and released, 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. And we said that, look, Russia's been doing this for even back going to the Soviet Union days. They're going to continue to do this. Vulnerabilities are out there. Don't put any voting apparatuses on the internet at all, mm-hmm. right? Which it's kind of relevant nowadays, since I don't know what morons would think it was a good idea to use an app at all for any voting whatsoever. We should not be having any voting done at all of anything that jumps onto the internet and rides over the fiber network. So we've been the ones that have been, that have talked about and confirmed that the Russians do bad and nefarious things, and have been and will continue to do so. But they've built a narrative that we're like in denial of that, and now we're shifting and blaming it on Ukraine. Well, the truth is that no, we're the ones who actually, they didn't even read our report. They mocked our report. So we're the ones that confirmed that Russians did this, the very first ones. And oh, by the way, they've refused to investigate at all what the hell was Fusion GPS and other Democratic operatives doing in Ukraine that led to high-level Ukrainian officials bashing the Trump campaign in 2016, which is unprecedented. It's unprecedented to have a diplomat in Washington, D.C., even from our most, our adversaries. You seldom see them take sides in a presidential race. As a matter of fact, I don't know of another example that I've seen. There probably is one out there. But to go with a public attack against a campaign in a local Washington, D.C. rag, I think is unprecedented. So clearly there were operations that were being conducted in Ukraine. Our investigation that they've continued to ignore, we know Nellie Orr testified, who was a Fusion GPS operative whose husband was the conduit of taking stuff into the DOJ, Bruce Orr, one of the highest level civilian DOJ officials. And I don't mean to throw all these words out, but I'm guessing your listeners know most of these names.
Right.
We know that she said that some of the sourcing did come from Ukraine. She testified to that to our committee. So the fake news media out there, they can prostitute themselves all they want, but it doesn't change the facts. Our only battle that we have as Republicans is to try to get around that funnel, get around, like I started with, the 90% of the content gets shoved into the funnel, and then it gets, we see it through Google, Facebook, and Twitter, and it's poisoning Americans. We got to figure out ways to go around that, which is why, I do things like, my own podcast. It's why I come on podcasts like yours, because we're trying to reach people and get outside of that funnel.
I just want to ask two last questions.
Even though people might be watching this on YouTube.
That's true.
But you have no other platform to really put this on. I mean, you're kind of a prisoner, and so am I. I mean, I have to use, iTunes.
On February 7, 2020, 2 days after President Trump was acquitted by the Senate in his impeachment trial, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who testified in the House impeachment inquiry, and his twin brother, Lieutenant Colonel Yevgeny Vindman, were removed from the National Security Council and reassigned. On the same day, U.S. Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland was removed from his post. Obviously, President Trump is well within his executive power and constitutional right to say hire, fire, or reassign anyone he wants. Do you think it was the right move?
So I think I think this is very relevant because it gets back to how we started this podcast about talking about General Flynn.
Mm-hmm.
It's what General Flynn was going to do when he came in. And so this needed to be done over 3 years ago. It's what General Flynn was planning to do as National Security Advisor. The size of that national security staff was, at one point like over 500, I believe. And they were left with all sorts of Obama era holdovers. I mean, that is like, that's like the example of having the fox guard the hen house.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been saying very publicly for a long time, I've said it all sorts of different ways, but they should remove everybody from the White House grounds that was there pre-Trump and just isolate them somewhere else until you can figure out, who's doing the leaking.
Yeah.
So, and the bottom line is, they're not even, it's not like these people have been fired, they're still working for the government.
In the midst of this impeachment affair, President Trump, he was acquitted. Democrats accused you of having ties to Ukraine, at least in November, which you cite that CNN report that you had, gone to Vienna to meet with the former prosecutor, Viktor Shokin, who Joe Biden, when he was vice president, advocated to fire because he was looking into corruption in Burisma, who his son, Hunter Biden, was a board member of. But they specifically say there were calls between you and Lev Parnas, who is an associate of Rudy Giuliani. And you said on Fox News that you had a call, or you at least recall having a conversation with Lev Parnas. And you said it was pretty random. This one, maybe like a clarification, like to what extent would there be, say, a necessity that he would reach out to you? Do you think it was something that was relating to Joe Biden, or was it just? Do you think you may have been set up?
So it goes back to everything that we've been talking about. We've been investigating Ukraine for a long time, and we continue to investigate Ukraine because we've been trying to figure out why were all these high-level Ukrainian officials involved in the attacks on a political campaign, on the Trump campaign in 2016. We still haven't gotten to the bottom of the Black Ledger yet. Okay, we didn't talk about that.
All right, so what's the Black Ledger?
Originated in Ukraine, and it was used to investigate Paul Manafort. It now looks like that Black Ledger. So this was money that Paul Manafort and many other swamp creatures around here, Republican and Democrat, they've long been gleaning on to money that's coming out of the former Soviet countries, especially Ukraine. So somebody wrote essentially a fake document, we believe, that dirtied up Manafort, that triggered, a criminal investigation. Now, it looks like later they did find something that Manafort had done wrong, but it had nothing to do with the Trump campaign. Mm-hmm. Okay, but that document was fraudulent. Why would people in Ukraine create that document? Who created that document? How did it end up in the hands of our intelligence agencies and was used to justify this investigation into the Trump campaign, which we now know is all a hoax and wrong? So the idea that myself or Rudy Giuliani would be investigating Ukraine and there's something wrong with that is nonsense. And the media's tried to spin that all kinds of different ways. I've always said the same thing for a long time. We've been looking at Ukraine and continue to look at figures in Ukraine because we want to figure out what the hell was going on there. So
did the impeachment inquiry or anything like that sort of open up the doors?
No, because all this was done. Matter of fact, a lot of this was being done in the springtime. I mean, it was being done in the fall. I mean, we knew once we had that information from Nellie Orr when she had testified, that was a lead. We knew the Black Ledger was a problem. We knew we had all these people. So we were looking at this and all through the end of 18 into early 19 in the spring. And so, we were talking to all sorts of cast of characters that would bring us information. And we have every day people call this office or the House Intelligence Committee office and they say, or they email and they say, we've got information that the Congress needs to see. We're an oversight committee. That's what we're here for. Mm-hmm. We're here for Americans, foreigners, they can bring us information that they think we need to have. And so the whole issue you ask about Parnas, I didn't even know who the hell the guy was. I didn't know his name. And so when that all first broke, I had to go back and look at all the records. So the media's continued and the left has continued to lie about that I had said something any different. All I said was I'm not going to trust whatever phone records you guys release. Once I looked at my phone records, there was one call, okay, despite what they say. Mm-hmm. I listened, didn't remember the guy's name, and then I referred him over to the appropriate staff, which that will happen today, I guarantee you, at least once, if not 5 times.
Have you thought about just turning off your cell phone?
I'll meet with foreigners every day. I meet with foreign ministers that come in to see me. I meet with intelligence agencies that come in to see me from foreign countries, and we have people that drop stuff off at this office, email, phone calls, et cetera, et cetera. Every single day, that's what we do. So the idea that this guy Parnas and his buddy, who clearly have an axe to grind, they're American citizens, they have an axe to grind in Ukraine, they think they had information. The reality is we don't have any information from them. They never provided anything. But they have the right as American citizens, as do all people, to bring us information. And for anyone to make any light of that or even question that, it's only because you're trying to build a false narrative because you got your ass kicked. And the Russia hoax, you were in on it. The Ukraine hoax, they were in on that. And the fact that they would believe somebody who's now probably going to go to jail for a long time and indicted on many felonies, like Parnas, they ought to be embarrassed of themselves, but I've been around long enough to know they're not going to be embarrassed of themselves.
Well, Congressman Devin Nunes from California, representing the 22nd Congressional District, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.